Hello. I'm going to start off this explanation of what archetypes are with what probably seem like really dopey questions, but here they are. First of all, how many wheels does a car have? Now this is not a trick question, I'm asking you about the wheels that touch the ground, not steering wheels and spare wheels and all of that. How many wheels does a car have? I bet you didn't have to think too hard about that. How many legs does a chair have? And again, no tricks here, just how many legs does a chair have? And by the way, I'm not getting at that the answer to everything is 4, but I guess you didn't have to think very hard about that either. Who wears a crown? Again, not very complicated. I guess where it gets complicated is, are these answers always true? Do cars always have 4 wheels? Now they don't always have 4 wheels, they mostly do. There are very rare cars that have 3 wheels, and there are some cars that have, 6 and 8 wheels. These are the exception. Some chairs in fact have 1 leg. They're like stools, but they're not stools, they've got a back to them. They're a chair, but they've got 1 leg. You could have 100 legs and it would still be a chair. Likewise, a king or queen would normally wear a crown, but it also could be a kid dressing up. It could be any number of things. Now, none of these things have kind of meanings. The answers aren't enshrined in legislation and nobody sat down and agreed on them. We just understand that things have an archetypal form, a form that we expect them to have. And I guess it happens the majority of the time, but nobody sits down and crunches the numbers and says, yes, we all agree that cars have 4 wheels because here's the statistical analysis and so forth. This is just not how archetypes come about. And they're just embedded in our consciousness. So, let's have a look and see what an archetype is. If we look in the dictionary, the very short definition is that it is an original model or a prototype. Now, a prototype is the one you build before you build the production ones. And that's somewhat true of what we're talking about, but that suggests that again somebody came up with a chair that every chair since has been based on. And that chair had 4 legs, and that's just not necessarily true. Often the archetypal something is actually quite different to the one that we made first. I'm not saying the dictionary is wrong, I'm just saying we want a more sophisticated understanding. So, let's look to this fellow, whose name is Carl Jung. He was a psychoanalyst and philosopher. He's been dead for a while now, and he was a student of this guy who you might have heard of called Sigmund Freud. These two, between them, pretty much invented a modern psychiatry and psychology. And in Jungian psychology, an archetype is a primitive mental image, so it's a basic mental image that we inherit through our culture, and it's meant to be present for everybody. Everybody is meant to have these archetypes in their head. Another way of thinking of it is that there's a recurring symbol or motif that appears in art and literature and so forth, such as, the stop sign. We can recognise the stop sign, and most people from cultures can. Now, this is a consciously constructed archetype, this one, but the ones we're talking about with characters aren't. So, before I wrap up this introduction, here's a bit of a puzzle for you. Now, the answer is not Rubik's Cube. I'll pause for a second to let you see if you can work it out. The answer is in fact chess. You only have quite a small number of pieces in chess, and they're quite limited in what they can do. Nevertheless, you can have an incredibly complicated game, in fact one of the most challenging games known to man, with these very simple pieces, probably 6 or 8 in total, and moving them around quite a limited space. And stories are like that too. We actually have sorry, I've gone blank for a second here. We actually have a relatively small number of characters that we use in most stories. And you've probably noticed this when you're watching stories. So, those characters are called archetypes, and I'll come back shortly and tell you about some of them. Hello and welcome to part 2 of my talk about archetypes. In the last one I talked about cars and chairs and crowns and dictionaries and old psychiatrists and stuff, but now I want to talk about one of the 11 types of archetypal characters. Before I introduce this one, I want to say that there is no definitive list of archetypal characters. Jung put some up, other writers have tweaked them. This is actually just my collection of the ones that I think are most useful, the ones I'm most familiar with. So if something's missing from this list, it doesn't mean it's not an archetype. If something's on this list, it generally means other people are talking about it. I don't think I invented any here, but these are my choice of 11 archetypes, so don't get too hung up on it. If you see other lists other places, listen to them too. So let's start with what I think is a nice solid beginning. What do these guys have in common? For those of you, I hope most of you guys know that this is Obi-Wan Kenobi from Star Wars. This is, of course, Albus Dumbledore from Harry Potter. This is Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. I want to say Morpheus, but I'm not sure. It's certainly that dude from The Matrix. All of these characters have something in common, even though they're from different decades, and there are characters like this going back hundreds and hundreds of years. What these guys have in common is that they are all examples of the old man wizard. So, let's look at what these guys have in common, because I hope that as I unfold this you'll begin to see that these are basically the same character. First of all, the old man wizard is old. He's a kind of grandfather figure, although he plays a kind of fatherly figure to other characters. A kind of grandfather-father figure. It's not particularly important which, although he's generally older. He is invariably wise, which is to say he has seen a lot of the world and he understands a lot of the world, and Dumbledore's a fantastic example of this. But it's also worth keeping in mind, wise doesn't mean cannot make a mistake, or is not sometimes foolish, because very often the old man wizard, thinks that he knows too much, is a bit arrogant, a bit sort of overly confident, but that's another story. Part of what the old man wizard does is that he opens up a larger world for our hero. In Gandalf here, he takes the hobbits out of Hobbiton and takes them on an adventure all the way across Middle-earth. But this happens in all kinds of films, not just fantasy films. You might have the old cop showing the new cop how the system really works. You might literally have a grandfather showing a grandson what the world's really about. Now, often, I would say 90% of the time, the old man wizard is in fact a man. There's no reason why it couldn't be a woman, and there are some notable examples of where this character is in fact female, but often it's a man. Another telling thing about the old man hero is that he can't be there for the last bit of the story. He has to be in some way removed so that the hero can act alone. So if you look back through these characters, it's true of Obi-Wan, it's true of Gandalf, it's true of Dumbledore, it's true of Morpheus, it's often true of the old man hero. So his central question, and it is almost always a he, but it doesn't have to, is can I teach this boy or girl? Can I pass on what I need to pass on in the time that I've got left? So, what I will leave you with is the question of, can you think of any other old man wizards in stories? And I bet you can. And I'll leave you with that thought and come back soon with the next archetype. Hello, here's the next part of my introduction to character archetypes. The last character archetype that we talked about was the old man wizard. Now, the old man wizard is very common, and their central question is, can I teach this boy or girl? But in order for there to be an old man wizard, you need a character which is even more common. And this character is a sulky farm boy, which is not the character archetype, that's just what he is also. So this is Luke Skywalker from the Star Wars films, but he could be basically the same character in any number of films. He is our standard hero. Our standard hero is young. I couldn't give you an exact age that they have to be under, but they have to be young. In some films, like Spy Kids, they might be 10. Sometimes your hero might be in their 30s. When you've got spy films and so forth. Although again, you have those in their teens. Your hero is brave. It might take them a lot of the story to find their bravery or to really make the most of it, but our hero is inherently brave. They are handsome. They are somebody people want to like. There's nothing kind of ambiguous about them. They're obviously a good guy. They look good. They are often quite naive. Your hero believes in good, but doesn't really understand the larger world, and that's one of the things they need the old man wizard for, is to open up the world for them. The hero's central question is, can I slay the dragon? Now, I'm using that in the general sense, in that it is kind of the dragon being I've vagued out, the danger, the terrorists, the end of the world, the great disease, whatever it is. The hero's question is, am I strong enough to to do this. So I'm sure that if you think about it, you can think about heroes in all kinds of things. I would say 80% of stories are hero-based. There is somebody who we understand to be good, slugging it out to try and, beat the dragon. Heroes have traditionally been mostly male, but there's no good reason why they should be, since all of the qualities that attach themselves that we expect in the hero can equally apply to women. They can be young, brave, handsome and naive, and also want to slay the dragon. And increasingly there are more and more female heroes, and I bet if you think about it you can name a few. So, that's the end of my introduction to the hero, and I'll be back very shortly to tell you about a different type of hero. Okay, it's time to press on with our character archetypes. In the last little snippet we talked about the hero, who is young and brave and handsome and naive and wants to slay the dragon. What is different about this type of hero, I would ask you? It's not just that he has a beard and is wearing a singlet. This hero is quite different. He is in fact the dark hero. Unlike the dark hero, the dark hero is actually dark as in they often have dark hair. They put them in dark clothing, as we can see here. They are dangerous. They have often actually killed people. They have done terrible things. And not necessarily because they had to, but sometimes they just had dark pasts where they were not good men. As this guy Money here in the Clint Eastwood classic Unforgiven. These are people who have done bad things. The dark hero is very much a man of action. They will go out there and get the job done, maybe not nicely, but they will do what needs doing, and they are perhaps even more ready to go to action than the hero is. The central question for the dark hero is actually more interesting than the question is for the hero. The hero only has to ask themselves, can I beat the dragon? But what the dark hero has to ask themselves is basically, will I join the team and do the right thing, or will I go on being selfish and keep doing the wrong thing? So that is what defines the dark hero. The dark hero is very popular at the moment. Lots and lots of films have dark heroes, and all those vampire books and so forth, all dark heroes, very much so. So before I go, I'd pick up your favourite films, books, ask yourself who's a dark hero. I bet you'll find them everywhere. Okay, it's time for the next part of our discussion of archetypes. So far we have had Lego blocks, old psychiatrists, old man wizards, heroes, dark heroes. But next we have an archetype, and there is nothing dark about this one. I think it's often best represented by the Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. A comedic, loyal, funny character, in lots of ways kind of part of the heart and soul of that movie. He of course represents the sidekick. Batman has Robin, Dorothy had the Straw Man, Luke Skywalker has R2-D2. These guys have stuff in common, the sidekicks. First of all, they are often funny. They have a particular style of humour which I'd struggle to kind of adequately define for you, but they are there. The hero can be deadly earnest and often has trouble being funny, but the sidekick gets to be funny. It can be physical comedy, which is a lot of what they do with R2-D2. It can be verbally funny, which they did in the old Batman TV show. The sidekick is also intensely loyal. The sidekick will stand by the hero, and this is common to sidekicks. And the sidekick, also needs saving in some sense. George Costanza here needs saving from himself and his own stupidity, but sidekicks invariably get themselves into trouble so that they need finding. So let's do a little bit of sidekick spotting. Who is the sidekick in the Shrek movies? I'm not going to tell you what the answer is, but I am going to point. Actually, there's kind of two sidekicks. And they get to be funny in a way that the hero, who I would argue is in fact a dark hero, doesn't get to be. Let's look at the Cars movies, and your sidekick is there right to the hero's side, and he is funny, he is loyal, and to some extent he needs saving. Another classic sidekick we see sitting there right next to the hero, and you can see that bewildered look on his face. Ron Weasley, again intensely loyal, very funny, much funnier than Harry ever gets to be, and terribly, terribly loyal. So, on the closing note for this, Can you think of the sidekicks in your favourite stories? Okay, I'm back again to talk about another one of our 10 or 11 archetypes, depending on how you count them. This one is so common that it is really striking when you see a story that does not have this character archetype in it. Reservoir Dogs, which is one of my favourite films, is really notable for not having one of these in it, and it's not ogres if you're looking at the picture. So I'll have a flip through and you've probably already worked out what this is. There we have Princess Leia from Star Wars, Cho from Harry Potter, and Sally from Cars. Now, they have one thing in common, obviously, they have their gender, but there's something much more in common, and it's so striking how common this is that when you do happen to have, say, a book that doesn't have this character archetype in it, they'll often put it into a movie. And in fact, lots of stories, this character archetype just comes kind of bolted on. The story itself that this archetype represents, they just seem to have to put in everything. It's a bit like Salt. And of course, I'm talking about the love interest. While your hero's off saving the dragon, he also gets to get the girl, although in these days sometimes the hero gets to get the boy, whether the hero's male or female. But there is a love interest, so it isn't just a female love interest, it can be a male love interest, depending on the story. Buffy notably has a number of male love interests, who also get to be different character archetypes at different times. So let's have a look at what they have in common. First of all, they tend to be young, and they tend to be female. You will occasionally see a story where the love story is between two older people, but it's uncommon. And you will occasionally see stories, although these are getting more common, where the love interest is male. Although they do tend to be a love interest plus something else. Whereas, I'm sorry to say, more often than not, when you're a female love interest, sometimes that's your entire part, just to be the object of desire for the male hero. So, young, female for the most part, attractive almost universally. You can be kind of quirky attractive, but you need to be attractive. And you need some kind of saving or rescuing. So while you might actually need to be rescued from the dragon, although that's a very old trope, but you need some kind of saving. So there you have it. There is a really, really common archetype, and I defy you to find 10 stories, to go and find 10 books or 10 movies that do not have this archetype in it. The next archetype that I want to talk about is actually one that doesn't pop up a lot. It is common across a large number of stories. Like if you look at hundreds of stories, you'll see this one in there regularly, but I can think of lots and lots of stories where this one isn't used. And in this case, it's exactly what it looks like. It is in fact just the child. And sometimes the child looks like a child, and sometimes the child doesn't. But they are all conform to the child stereotype. So, what is the child like? The child is innocent. If the child is, a demonic little child, then in actual fact they're a different archetype. They're blending archetypes for effect. Your archetypal child is innocent. They don't know evil. They need protecting, either from the world at general, but often from a specific evil, and for the most part they are actually children, although as you can see they are sometimes robots, and sometimes they're adults who have these characteristics of being innocent and needing protecting and being childlike. So anyhow, that's the child. Most recently we talked about the child archetype, how they are innocent and need saving. And something more common than that is this archetype, although to look at Professor McGonagall there you might think that I'm going to talk about witches, but in actual fact it's not witches that I'm interested in, it is mothers. Now, it is true that these archetypes don't actually allow a great deal of range and depth to women. They can be the love interest, they can be mothers, and also they can be witches, but we'll come to the witches shortly. But the mother archetype is actually pretty rigid. You don't often see this blended with other things. So let's look at what goes into being a mother in a story. You need to be nurturing, you need to be looking after people for their best interests, even if you're sometimes a little bit stern. You need to be caring, you need to be selfless. These mothers, and we see it again and again in stories, will literally lay down their lives to protect their children or the people they're nurturing. And lastly, they get to be beautiful but rarely sexual. You might have a hint that they have some kind of sexual allure for somebody, but their primary purpose is not in fact to be sexual at all. So that's the mother, I was going to say stereotype, and really it is both a stereotype and an archetype, and we'll be back shortly to talk about the witch. Hello, it's Mr. O'Mara here again, continuing our series of character archetypes. Now, recently we looked at Professor McGonagall from the Harry Potter series, and as you can see, she is a witch because she's dressed up as a witch, obviously, and she does magic and stuff. But this is actually not her character archetype, and we've talked about this before. You are defined not by how you look, but by how you behave, or how your behaviour is presented. And she's actually a mother archetype, but there is a witch archetype. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of this. Now, this is the witch from The Wizard of Oz, of course, witch nose and green skin and so forth. Sometimes the witch actually doesn't have magical powers, although this particular one does, but you can just be the wicked older woman. And as you can see, they do have a kind of consistent look about them. Although she's actually, this one from Bellatrix Lestrange from the Harry Potter series is a little bit different in one respect, so we'll come back to her. So let's have a look at what your witch typically has. Typically she is old. She can go from being just a little past middle age to downright ancient, unbelievably old. She is ugly. She is ugly within and she is ugly on the outside. She is not, by and large, beautiful. She is tricky. The wicked old lady cannot be trusted. She might offer you a tasty apple, but it's poisoned inside. She might offer you Turkish delight. She might offer to give you great riches. I was going to say witches. She's probably not going to offer you witches. But all of this is a trick. She is female, and she is destructive. There might be some cases where this archetype, they put a man in the part, but honestly I actually can't think of any. We almost always throw this at women. And she's not just tricky, and she's not playful, she is downright destructive. She's evil. This is not a good archetype to be. And that's worth keeping in mind because sometimes she's not described as a witch but as the evil stepmother. And somebody pointed out to me that there are a lot of stepmothers in stories where there aren't stepfathers because women used to die a lot during childbirth. So it would be reasonably common for men to marry again, to have somebody to raise their kids. And lots of kids would have this experience of this older woman coming in that they didn't like. So stepmothers get a very bad rap. I think it's actually a bit of a shame in stories that we so often make stepmothers evil, but it is one of the archetypes. That's not to say we should keep doing it, but it is. And it actually doesn't much matter whether she's magical or not. So that's a really common one, particularly in old fairy tales and stuff, but it still persists in modern stories. So there's a witch archetype, and I'll be back soon to talk about something, the male almost equivalent. Hello, it's Mr. O'Mara here to bring you the last one or two archetypes depending on how you look at it. So let's have a look at some examples and see if you can work out what these people have in common. Bart Simpson, pointy head, yellow skin. Mystique from X-Men, blue skin, not particularly pointy head. And the Joker from Batman, also funny skin. So what in fact these people have in common is not that they have weird skin, although that is actually part of it, although a very small part of it. It is that they represent the trickster or the deceiver. Now the difference is that the trickster is kind of just having fun, more like Bart Simpson, and the deceiver has this kind of more evil edge to them. They're both having a bit of fun by tricking you, but also they're out to destroy things. So the trickster is the more innocent form. So let's have a quick look at what they're like. First of all, they are definitely mischievous. They get up to mischief. If you look particularly at the old Batman TV show, the Joker was very much, a joker. He was somebody having fun, and part of it was just he had fun messing with people's heads. In the later creations, he got to be a bit more evil, and so he's probably more deceiver than trickster there. We see Mystique here from the X-Men. The trickster is underhanded. So rather than actually come straight out and fight you, they'll pretend to be something else. They'll play a joke on you. They'll set a trap for you. So they're not like a destroyer who's just out there saying, I'm this big target of evil. The trickster will try and be underhanded and trick you into something. Sometimes they are the double agent, like Verbal here in The Usual Suspects, which if you haven't seen, it's a fantastic film. So sometimes your trickster is playing off both sides against each other. So the trickster and the deceiver, you can count it as one archetype or two. I think they're very, very similar. trickster's more innocent, the deceiver, as verbal is here, the double agent is more malicious. And that's actually the end of my introduction to the archetype. So if you should go back and watch all 10 of these videos and you'll get a good sense of the pieces we're playing with. Hello, it's Mr. Omar again, and we're talking about one of our most dominant archetypes. Pretty much wherever you have a hero, you have this archetype. So let's have a look at these men and see what they do in common. There, of course, we have Lord Voldemort from the Harry Potter series. We have Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs. And we have Megatron from Transformers. And I could just keep going and going and going. You can find these people all over the shop. They are, of course, the Destroyer. So let's see what Destroyers have in common and what separates them from other archetypal characters. The Destroyer is most commonly very verbal. They talk a lot, but they don't talk. They have a kind of threatening, deep, a voice that sounds serious. They use their words to sound intelligent. They use their words to terrorise. Hannibal Lecter particularly does this. Actually, Voldemort does this quite a bit. They are older. They are an older man normally, or an older robot in this case, and they are old and strong. They are powerful. The hero needs to defeat something bigger than himself. This is what makes him heroic. So he is fighting somebody who has more world experience than him and just greater strength than him. And importantly, and this is what often separates the old man wizard from the Destroyer, is that the Destroyer is evil. The Destroyer destroys lives, it destroys property, it creates horror, it creates terror. And this is what makes them bad, is that they destroy things. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship there. They're bad because they destroy, and they destroy because they're bad. So anyhow, that's a key archetype there, your Destroyer, and I'll come back shortly with something a bit more fun. Hello, it's Mr. O'Mara here. Now that we've gone through all the archetypes, I thought we might go and spot some characters and see which archetypes they conform to. Okay, the one I really want you to be paying attention to is little Anakin Skywalker in this shot. He changes archetypes throughout the course of the 6 movies, but what I want you to concentrate on him in his boy form and see what he is, see what colours he's wearing, see if you can decide who he is. And by the way, you can probably work out what character, what archetype it is you can see behind him too. Next up, we have Jung. Not dark hair, but not light hair, interestingly. But, very determined. You can probably work out what archetype that is. I'm not going to tell you at this point. This ugly, scary-looking dude with the bad teeth and the scary tattoos. You can probably work out what he does for a living, archetype-wise. I actually think this is interesting because he looks, I think you'd probably jump to thinking he's one type of archetype, but if you think about how he actually conducts himself and how much of what he does might be right or wrong, I think you might come up with something a little bit different. Next up, we have Lara Croft, and again, you could rush into guessing what she was, but think about what she actually does, and I think you might come up with a different type of archetype. Here we have young Keanu Reeves being, I can't remember his name. I want to say Nemo, but I know that's not right. From the Matrix films, Neo is what I meant to say. And he's a particular type of, although interestingly, his clothes kind of disguise the archetype that he is. In actual fact, all of their clothes are running against their archetype. They're dressed like villains, but they're in fact far from villains. Next up, we actually talked about this during the earlier introductions, and it's fairly obvious what her archetype is. His archetype's interesting. He looks like a particular archetype for most of the 8 films or 7 books, but in the end we realise that he's in fact something else. So that's interesting. Sometimes we have to take, depending on when we're looking at somebody, they might actually be fulfilling a different archetype, but see if you can decide what Snape is. Miss Piggy, I think you should be able to work out fairly quickly what archetype she is. Yoda, I think understand what archetype he is you can. Yes, I know that was dreadful. Chewbacca, that's not a good photo of Chewbacca. I think it should be fairly obvious what type of archetype he is too. I almost said it then. In fact, it's something he shares with these two loons, these two hobbits. I think this one's actually a bit trickier. You have to look at what he does. The colours he's dressed in, the kind of vacant expression on his face give you a bit of a clue, but you need to think about the way he conducts himself to get a real sense of what character it is that Forrest Gump represents. Kermit, I think you could fall into thinking that he was a sidekick, but in actual fact his mission is somewhat different to that, and it's actually a mission that he shares with young Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So you might want to think about what their actions say about who they are. Similar but different, we have Han Solo, played by Harrison Ford, in the Star Wars universe. Think about what type of character he is. The way he dresses gives you a bit of a hint. It's the broken wand here that gives you a hint about young Ron Weasley. I'll leave you a second to think about what archetype he represents. I probably don't need to say too much here. I reckon you can work that one out. Again, I think that the clothes and the firearms make this one fairly obvious. This is a dyed-in-the-wool, you couldn't get him wrong. He's got dark hair, but everything about him radiates goodness. You can work out who that is. This one's interesting because you might think, being in The Godfather, this is Vito Corleone, that he is in fact a destroyer, but I would actually suggest that if you know the film itself, he is in fact quite a different archetype. I think this is one of the cleverest things about The Godfather, in that he is in fact only destroying is a small part of what he does. However, it's not a small part of what everybody does. Hermione Granger does different things in different films, so depending on when you're looking at her, she's a different archetype. I think that Batman is really interesting because I think they're trying very hard for him to be a particular archetype, but I'm not sure that they're always successful. I think that it's very, very clear what type of archetype Luke Skywalker is, and I also think you'd be hard-pressed not to work out Fozzie Bear. So I might come back and give you the answers in another short video, but see if you can go through this and work these all out for yourself.